Everyone, welcome to Bio 231 lecture series. We are going to be starting the autonomic nervous system. We'll see if this is going to end up being one long lecture or two short ones. It kind of depend on how we get going here. So why don't we just go right into the notes and get started. We've already seen this little pathway of the nervous system before. So why don't we just fill in the basic names together, and then we'll figure out where our last part of the nervous system is that we need to talk about. So first, remember, information comes in along via our sensory afferent pathways, and that's the blue arrow there, and it goes up to the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, right? It goes through those afferent pathways, through that peripheral nervous system, I should say, in and out. This is in, and we'll get to out in just a second. Then those sensory fibers that are in the PNS go, again following the blue arrow there, to the CNS. And remember, the CNS is our brain and our spinal cord, where we're going to integrate that information and decide if we're going to do something with it. Then, if we are going to do something, we're going to send messages out, efferent pathways into the PNS system, right? Going down those upper motor and lower motor neurons we talked about, for example, as one, and we go to the motor pathway. Okay, so then we're in our motor division. And the motor division is divided into two areas, the somatic, all right, and then we have our ANS, or the other name for it. Not sure why that keeps moving there. Hold on, let's move you back up. And that we can also say visceral motor pathway or visceral motor neurons are part of this, okay? And then the ANS is divided into the sympathetic and into the parasympathetic, which we'll talk about more details in a little while. All right, so one thing to think about here is we want to compare now these two motor pathways. We want to compare somatic and ANS, so we can see what's the same about them, what's different, and why there's a subdivision. All right, so for ANS, let's go ahead and, or actually for somatic, let's go ahead and put a little triangle here. And for ANS, let's put a little circle right here, okay? All right, and so then the somatic is right here, the triangle, and the autonomic is right here with the circle. Okay, so now we can see where we're talking about right below. So, so it says motor outflow to smooth, that should be muscles, smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and glands. That's part of the ANS. That's where the ANS is sending messages, right? Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So what does that leave? That leaves skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is handled by the somatic system. It's not structurally different, only functionally different. The same nerves carrying somatic afferent, these, and efferent fibers carry ANS fibers. Okay? Body attempts to maintain balance, an unending job. Okay? Now, it was called the visceral afferent subdivision because it was sending out messages efferently to viscera, organs, so that was good name for it as well. But autonomic refers to that it's happening behind the scenes. Your body is taking care of these things without conscious registration. So it's only motor supply to visceral muscle, not skeletal muscle, and to the needy areas like the heart, the lungs, the stomach, and also helps regulate blood temperature and glands, or blood temperature and blood pressure. And one other thing that maybe this implies, visceral muscle and glands is where the motor supply goes to. And this is unconscious or involuntary fine-tuning of the structures innervated. Okay, so everything happening in the ANS you don't have conscious control over. All right, now let's review these two. We'll leave them up at the top there. So somatic is getting motor information going down an efferent portion, all right? And so what's it going to innervate? First, it innervates skeletal muscle only. The cell bodies are in the CNS at the anterior horn, and the axons go and reach the skeletal muscles, the effectors. The axon processes can be quite long because of this, because they can go very far, all right? These axon processes tend to be long. They're under voluntary control. And there are no ganglia in the motor division, the somatic division. So remember, ganglia are a little bundle of cell bodies of neurons that are either going into or out of. So like, for example, we looked at the dorsal root ganglia, which was sensory, up here on our sensory part, that was centering sensory information, and there was a bundle of cell bodies that were in a ganglia just outside of the spinal cord. There are not any ganglia here. All right, let's contrast that to the autonomic system. So first off, different innervations. Instead of innervating skeletal, it innervates cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands. All the glands, endocrine and exocrine glands. There's a distinction. So this, if you look here in this picture of the somatic one, we have the anterior horn, that's where the cell body is, and we just send a message out to the skeletal muscle. Okay, that's it. So this is the spinal cord right here. But in the autonomic nervous system, in most cases, we have what's called a 2-neuron chain. So we send a message out, we go along what's called a preganglionic axon before the ganglia, and then there's a ganglia, and we have a synapse there. Then we have the cell body of the postganglionic axon goes out, and then it eventually will innervate the visceral effector. So in the somatic system, we only have one, there's no ganglia. In this one, we have two, and we have a synapse in the ganglia. Okay, so we have a 2-neuron chain. We call the one in front preganglionic, and the one behind it postganglionic. And there is a synapse in that autonomic ganglion. Okay, now those ganglia will have different names. We'll talk about them in a minute. So these are visceral motor efferent neurons. And remember, these have unconscious or subconscious control. Your body does all of this processing without you having to think about it. Now, so we just talked about this more complicated system of having two neurons. And we kind of are repeating what was on that previous page right here, and we can fill that in and kind of name everything in just a second. So let's go here to the notes, and we can kind of look at everything nicely. So it says, what are the components? A preganglionic axon, a preganglionic fiber, which includes mostly the axon, a postganglionic axon, and a ganglia. So now the preganglionic neuron cell bodies, so where it starts, are always in the CNS, and these are always, these preganglionic ones, okay, are always located in the CNS. The axons themselves are myelinated. Okay, so they're myelinated, so they can also be called white rami communicantes. Right? We talked a little bit about that name before. White tells us it's myelinated. And so they go out as white rami communicantes in the PNS. Now, the sympathetic fibers and the parasympathetic fibers go out in different places. So the parasympathetic go out your cranial nerves up here at the top near your neck and your head. And they also go out your sacral region, all right, down near your pelvic bone. So that's different. And then sympathetics are in the middle part from thoracic 1 vertebrae down to about lumbar 2. Okay, so very different there. Let's use a different highlight to underline those. So parasympathetics are that, and then sympathetics do that. And they each have a ganglia. They each have a preganglionic axon, a ganglia where they synapse, and a postganglionic axon. Now, the names of them are a little bit different. Okay? So, for sympathetic chain, we have either, do they have both of these in here? Hold on. Terminated. Yeah, so we're only going to talk about the sympathetic ones right now, I guess. The preganglionic axons, those white rami communicantes, terminate either in what's called a paravertebral ganglia. We also can call that a lateral ganglia. Either of those is correct. Okay? And they either terminate in a paravertebral one, or a prevertebral ganglia, which is also called the collateral ganglia. Now, I'm going to explain those more in a minute. The terms, the wording, sometimes it works really well and sometimes not so well. All right, so let's walk through the wording for a second. So paravertebral ganglia. All right, so we know a ganglia is that houses cell bodies, and they're going to house the cell bodies of the postganglionic axons. Vertebral, we know that means vertebrae. Para, so para means next to. Okay? So that's why it's either called paravertebral or lateral ganglia. These ganglia are right next to the spinal cord and are just on the other, just kind of right alongside of them laterally. So that's where that one comes from. But there are also some other ganglia that are farther out, that are between the spinal cord and the terminating organ, whatever that organ is. And so those are the pre or collateral ones. And so I don't like them because it's called prevertebral ganglia. So the first thing you would think of is before the vertebrae, right before the spinal cord. But it can't be before the spinal cord because this is motor. It's going from the spinal cord out to an organ. So pre really means before the effector. Okay. And I'll just show a picture of these in a minute. So if you're still not quite getting what I'm talking about, it's okay. We'll come back to those. But the take-home point is the sympathetics have two different ganglia, ones that are right next to the spinal cord and the vertebrae, and one that's in between the spinal cord and the organ that it goes out to. Parasympathetic we'll talk about in just a minute down here below. Now, the synapse occurs in the ganglia, and then the postganglionic cell bodies are located in these ganglia, and they extend out to the effector. Now these are unmyelinated. They're gray rami communicantes. All right? So we have the white rami communicantes and the gray rami communicantes. We have myelinated ones coming into the ganglia. We have unmyelinated ones leaving the ganglia. Now, the ganglia are generally found in the head, neck, and trunk regions because they are going to either be right next to the spine or in between the organs. And we've already talked about these two, next to the vertebrae and before the effector, right? These two are the sympathetic ones, okay? We'll keep that color that we just were looking at there. So there's that. Then the other one we haven't talked about was the parasympathetic one. And this one is called usually intramural or terminal. And what this means, intramural means within or next to the wall, right? Like intra, like right associated with a wall, right? Mural, think of like a mural on a wall. Or terminal, and terminal means the end of the line, right? If we're at the terminal station of the max line, we are at the very last line. And so what this wording means or tells us is that these ganglia are very near or in the wall of the effector. Okay, so in parasympathetic ones, we have the ganglia, but they aren't out. They aren't close to the spinal cord, or they aren't in between. They're way at the end near the effector itself. And so we call those terminal or intermural ganglia. Those ganglia contain the postganglionic cell bodies, and that's where the fibers synapse. We've already kind of said a lot of these things here. The fiber synapse. And sometimes fibers can pass through without synapsing. We'll talk about that in a minute. There are no ganglia for the somatic motor division. Remember, that's this right here, right? But there is a ganglia found in the dorsal root ganglion, which we talked about in sensory. So that's just a review. All right, so now let's look at this picture really quickly. You can find this picture or something similar to it. I don't know if your book actually has a really great version of this. It doesn't really. Yeah, there's one on page 543 that's kind of a little quiz question thing, and so we'll use this one and do it ourselves here. So first off, we're going to start here, because remember, this is motor output. We're sending things out. Now, we don't know what kind of ganglia this is right now. I mean, I actually do based on what it looks like, but you guys don't know. And so we're going to just call it a ganglia. We're not going to call it a preganglionic. We're not going to call it a paravertebral ganglia. We're not going to call it a prevertebral ganglia. We're not going to call it a paravertebral ganglia. We're not going to call it intramural ganglia yet. We'll get to that in a minute, but we just want to kind of make sure we know what's going on. So right here, this is the cell body for the preganglionic fiber. So we say preganglionic fiber cell body. Okay. And then this is this right here. If I can get it somewhere nearby. All right, I guess we'll do that. Preganglionic fiber axon. All right, and then it goes into a ganglia of some sort. Okay, we have a ganglia there. Now, we know that a synapse occurs. You can see the synapse right there. Go from electrical signal to a chemical signal, and then we go to another cell body. And guess what? This is the postganglionic fiber cell body. Okay? And we'll move that up a little bit if it'll let me. Okay. Right there. Then the message will go out and will go along the postganglionic fiber axon. Okay, to our visceral effector. So you're noticing terminology is important here. You want to know the difference between where the preganglionic fiber is and where the postganglionic fiber is. We want to know where the cell bodies are and where the axons are. And we want to know our different types of ganglia, which we'll get to later. Okay, so this is a big challenge in this section. Is there's a lot of new terms, a lot of words that you have to make sure you understand. If you can get the understanding of those terms, it makes your life a lot easier. Okay, we're going to talk about neurotransmitters for a second. I just had mentioned that there was a synapse and that we went from electricals to a chemical signal. We'll talk a little more about these towards the end of this section. Neurotransmitter effects. So in the somatic system, we mentioned before that we use acetylcholine, and it's always excitatory. All right. So if there's enough, we get an action potential, the muscle will contract. In the ANS, we either use epinephrine, norepinephrine, or acetylcholine, and their effects are dependent on receptor type. And there's those different receptor types, alpha and beta receptors. And so they'll either be inhibitory or excitatory, depending on what kind of receptors there. We'll talk more about that later. Now, we want to talk about the divisions of the ANS next. We want to talk about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Basically, what they do is they regulate our metabolic engine and respond to physiological stresses. So sympathetic tends to activate systems in our body to resolve stress, exercise, emergencies, things like that. Parasympathetic tends to quiet many systems of our body when we're resting, we're eating, we're repairing ourselves, we're sleeping. All right, so they work in opposition to each other. Sometimes you'll see the sympathetic division as called the fight or flight system. That's a little bit basic of a terminology, but it does get across the idea if you have a stressor that you need to react to. One thing is you can fight it or take it head on, right, and kind of become active. The other thing is you can become active in a different way, which is run away or avoid the stressor. But you would still activate your sympathetic system to do that. Okay, so one thing that's really good when you're looking at sympathetic and parasympathetic is to compare them and contrast them. What is the same about these? What is different? So the first thing is where it leaves the spine. And remember I said it goes out the T1 to L1, L2 range, and this is called thoracolumbar, all right, outflow. So thoracic and lumbar outflow. As I said, this system, sympathetic, prepares body parts and regions for emergencies, fight, protection, or flight, avoiding the encounter. So what do we want to do when we're in that kind of situation where we have an emergency to deal with? We need to have oxygen and glucose available to our muscles so we can activate those muscles and do things that we need to do, either fight or protect ourselves or take on the task, or flight, avoid it, get away from it. So think of things that should happen. These are all the kinds of things that would happen. Our heartbeat should increase. Our respiratory rate should go up. Our blood sugar should go up. All of those things are going to make oxygen and sugars available to our skeletal muscles. Our pupils should dilate so we can see in our periphery, especially if we are going to try to get away from something or we wanted to see our surroundings better. We'll vasodilate skeletal muscle to bring more blood into skeletal muscle, and will constrict peripheral vessels that aren't being used. That increases blood pressure, which we'll talk about a lot more in 232. Sometimes we use the E words to describe this. Exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment, right? When you're embarrassed, your heart rate goes up, your respiratory rate goes up, your vessels dilate in certain parts of your body, you get red, things like that. So now let's contrast that to parasympathetic. So the first difference is that it goes out the cranial sacral area. So it goes out cranial nerves and sacral nerves. Craniosacral. Okay. Craniosacral. Now, this is what we call the dominant controller of most autonomic effects, because most of the time we're in a more rest and relaxing mode. We don't want to activate our system unless we need to. So it's involved in things like energy acquisition and conservation. So when we're relaxing, when we're eating, when we're preparing food in a casual way, things like that. When we're sleeping. And so it's going to do, and it's going to allow the body to recuperate and repair. So this is going to be the opposite of everything I just said. The heartbeat is going to go down. Blood pressure is going to go down. Respiratory rate and depth will drop. Blood sugars will go away. into our body cells. We'll constrict our pupils to get less light in so we can relax and maybe go to sleep. But we will increase digestion, right? We also increase our urinary system. Increase urinary system as well. So it's not that everything is quieted in parasympathetic, it's that some things are quieted and some things are stimulated. We'll vasoconstrict skeletal muscle, but we'll often vasodilate peripheral vessels to other organs and to other parts of our periphery, like our skin. We sometimes use the D words for these: digestion, defecation, diuresis, things like that. All right. So there's a few things that are different and the same. Now we're going to talk about more things that are different and the same. So let's keep thinking about that. And one good way to compare and contrast is to actually kind of write out what's the same and what's different about them. And you have a couple different charts in your book. There is one on page 535 that does a compare and contrast of parasympathetic and sympathetic. That's 535 that you could look at, and a lot of what I'm going to cover here goes over that. So let's start with sympathetic. I think your book does it in the other direction. It does parasympathetic first and sympathetic second, but I like starting with sympathetic. So we've already said that it's thoracolumnar output, and we can see that here. Here is a picture. This picture is page 540. It looks slightly different in your book. I actually kind of like this picture better, and I'll explain why in a second. But it is here. I think I have my book. Oh, there it is. See, slightly different looking in your book, but same one. Figure 14.7. Okay, so now we said it goes out the thoracic and lumbar region. So here's our whole spinal cord. And look, starting around T1 to about L2, we see fibers leaving. And they're paired. They go out on both sides. We're only going to look at one side. All right? And we'll go over some details of that in just a minute. So we've got that first. Now, remember, our preganglionic fibers are called white rami communicantes. And those are from the cell bodies in the lateral horns of the spinal cord. Lateral horns of spinal cord to the ganglia. Right? So we've got cell bodies in the lateral horns of the spinal cord to a ganglia. And remember, there are two types, either prevertebral or paravertebral. We'll get back to those in a second. Then, and those you can see right here. These are these solid green lines, right? And in your notes, they're the dark green lines, okay? And sometimes they will synapse here at these ganglia, and sometimes they synapse out here in these ganglia, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay? All right, now we have the gray rami communicantes. These are the dotted line ones that you see here, or the light colored ones in your book. And the gray rami communicantes are postganglionic fibers. Postganglionic fibers from the ganglia to the organ. Okay, so they go from the ganglia out to the organ. Okay. Now, white rami communicantes, then, therefore, are short preganglionic fibers. Gray rami communicantes are long postganglionic fibers. All right, so why do we say that? Or how do we know that? Well, the short fibers are white because they're coming out of the spinal cord, and they're either going to right next to the spinal cord, and this sympathetic chain here is actually really right here next to the spinal cord. They put it out so we can write some words in, but it is literally next to it. I'll show you a picture on page 538 really quickly of what it really looks like. Right here. Okay, so here is your spinal cord, and this chain right here, which is called the sympathetic trunk ganglion chain, or sympathetic trunk, these are the paravertebral ganglion. They're right next to the spinal cord. Okay, so even though that picture that we just saw here seems to put them kind of off to the side, they really are right next to the spinal cord. So that means that the fibers that come out the spinal cord go a very short distance and then they might synapse. They might only synapse about an inch after they've left the spinal cord. Now there are, and those are the paravertebral ganglia, and they're in this thing called the sympathetic trunk or chain that goes up the whole length, and we'll talk more about that in a second. The prevertebral ganglia, the ones that are before the organs, they still aren't very far away from the spinal cord. And the reason that I said I liked this picture a little better is the ganglia are right here, and this is all on the aorta. All right, on the descending aorta here, coming off of the aorta. And so I'm going to come back to me for a second. So if you kind of think about it, your aorta is right about here going down, and your spinal cord's right in the middle. So those fibers, if they're going to a prevertebral ganglia, are only going about, maybe 3-4 inches away from the spinal cord before they synapse. So in both cases, we have pretty short preganglionic fibers. Now, once they synapse, they then have to go out to their organ, and that could be somewhat close in the case of like a heart or a lung, or somewhat farther down to the small intestine, large intestine, rectum, genitalia, out to glands in your head, things like that. So we generally say that the sympathetic one has shorter preganglionic fibers and longer postganglionic fibers between the two. Okay, so that's important to remember, and we'll contrast that to parasympathetic in a minute. Okay, so the sympathetic chain trunks houses the paravertebral ganglia. We just showed you that. Just showed you that picture, which was nice. All right, there. And those are bilaterally on the column, and there's a bunch of different ganglia, and the ganglia go up above the thoracic and lumbar region, and you kind of see that here. See how the ganglia go all the way up into the cranial area and the cervical area, and they go all the way down past the lumbar into the sacral region. But the original fibers don't go out there. They come out here. So that means that these fibers are going to have to go up this chain or down this chain sometimes to get their messages out where they need them to go. All right. Now, there are also the preganglionic. Well, then there are also prevertebral ganglia, and we'll get to those in a minute. Before we do, let's just mention that there's 3 divisions of this sympathetic chain. Okay, there's 3 divisions of the cervical part, the part that's way up here. And you can see these 3 chains, the superior one on top, the middle here in the center, and the inferior below. So let's just review those really quickly. So the cervical ones, the superior ganglion goes to the head and skin of the head and the blood vessels of the head. It goes to the dilator muscle of the eye. Remember, we want to dilate our pupils. It goes to glands, and also goes to the carotid body and sinus, which we'll talk about more next term, and it goes to the larynx, the pharynx, and the heart. So this ganglion goes to a lot of the things in the face and head, and also has heart involved. Now, interestingly, middle also does heart, and inferior does heart, and all 3 of them do the lung also. So all 3 of those ganglia are involved in the lung. So we have lots of innervation going out to 2 of our most important organs, the heart and the lung, to speed them up during sympathetic stimulation at all these different ganglia. Okay? That's all you really need to know about that particular ganglia there. All right, now, In that thoracolumnar region, where the prevertebral ganglia, where the preganglionic fibers are coming out, we want to look at the different ganglia. So we've already talked about the paravertebral ganglia here. Now we're going to talk about the prevertebral ganglia. And these are the ones that are found here, and I'll just highlight them just so you can see them. Okay, there's a bunch. There's 4 right there, and they're all in around that aorta area. And there's the 4 right there that I just highlighted. These have splanchnic nerves that go through them. And what a splanchnic nerve is a preganglionic fiber that doesn't synapse in the paravertebral ganglion but runs through them. So you'll see at times the fibers will go into the ganglia and then run past the ganglia and continue. All right, and that's called a splanchnic nerve. And you've got a couple here. You've got the greater splanchnic nerve going through a ganglia and out. You've got the lesser splanchnic nerve going through a ganglia and eventually out. So those are listed down here. And so let's highlight those for a second. So the greater splanchnic nerve synapses in the celiac ganglia, and this is a prevertebral ganglia, right? They always are not prevertebral. So they go through a paravertebral ganglia, and then they terminate in a prevertebral ganglia. So all these splanchnic nerves go through the paravertebral ganglia and then go out and go into a prevertebral somewhere. And there's one exception that goes out past it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so this greater splanchnic nerve tends to go and innervates the stomach, small intestine, liver, spleen, and kidney. So a lot of the organs in the abdominal pelvic area. And then the lesser splanchnic nerve, the lumbar splanchnic nerve, and the hypogastric, because these go to the superior mesenteric ganglia, the inferior mesenteric ganglia, and the hypogastric ganglia. Those I'm less concerned about, but what we'll just kind of say is these innervate in general. We can just put what they innervate in general. These innervate the intestines, reproductive organs, and bladder. Okay. Now, as I said, one of these splanchnic nerves not only goes through a paravertebral ganglia and doesn't synapse, it goes through a prevertebral ganglia and doesn't synapse, and it goes all the way out to the adrenal gland. And this is the greater splanchnic nerve right there. Okay, that one. Now, this we sometimes call our exception. So I'm going to write exception. Because the reason it's exception is, remember we said that sympathetic fibers always go out the spinal cord and have short preganglionic fibers, and then they synapse in either a para or a prevertebral ganglia, and then they go out from there along a postganglionic fiber to the organ. Well, this particular one doesn't ever synapse. It goes straight through, and see how it stays dark green here? It's still a myelinated fiber, and it goes all the way through and it never synapses. And so this one place is our exception. Our exception. The greater splanchnic nerve terminates in the adrenal medulla itself. So that means it's stimulated by preganglionics. It's only a preganglionic fiber. the adrenal gland secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine in the bloodstream. So that's what the adrenal gland does. So this might give you a little hint as to why this nerve does that, because this, every time you send a message along a nerve and you have to synapse, it takes time, right? There's a little delay because we have to go from an electrical signal to a chemical signal back to an electrical signal. So in this case, what we do is, if we want to release epinephrine and norepinephrine as a hormone into our bloodstream, and that will help increase our sympathetic effect, we send the message along one nerve, this greater splanchnic nerve, one fiber. We never synapse, and it gets to the adrenal gland really fast, and it releases that epinephrine and norepinephrine as quickly as possible into the bloodstream. So that may be the reason why that's the case. Now, I think the last thing we're going to talk about here in this lecture is the sympathetic fibers and how they go out. And then we'll start and go over the parasympathetic next lecture. So sympathetic preganglionic fibers reach the effector in 3 different ways, and our exception that we just talked about. So we can, why don't we draw an arrow right now to that exception and highlight this so we see that we're talking about it again. Now, your book, so this picture right here, your book has on page 539, and I actually like your book's version better. And so we're going to go over to this, and we're going to show you the 3 different ways plus our exception way that the fibers travel out. Okay? Now, let's go over there real fast. And it's back a couple pages. Okay, here it is. All right, so I'm going to zoom in so we can look at this. All right, so what we're looking at, what we're trying to figure out here is, when we're sending a message down our sympathetic pathways, how does it get to where it needs to go from the spinal cord? And there are 3 ways plus our exception. So the first way, we'll zoom way in here so you can see this. It says synapse in the trunk ganglion. Those are the paravertebral ganglion at the same level that it exits. So here's our lateral horn. We send a message out the ventral root, and it goes out, and it synapses here at our paravertebral ganglion in the sympathetic trunk. It's at the exact same level, and then we have our synapse, and we send a message out. Our gray rami communicante goes out to an organ. Okay, so it goes out, it synapses at the same level of paravertebral, and it goes out to an organ somewhere. The second way is we can synapse at one of the paravertebral ganglion in the sympathetic trunk at either a higher or lower level. These aren't 2 separate ones. This is just saying not at the same level. So look, we're going to come out here. Instead of synapsing here where we did in number 1, we go up, or we could go down. In this case, they're showing you up. Going up 1 level, maybe more than 1 level, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 levels. Then we synapse, then we send the message out. Okay, somewhere. That's our second way. Our third way is not synapsing at the paravertebral, but synapsing at the prevertebral. So message goes out the exact same way. It makes to the paravertebral, and it goes through. And remember, we said when it goes through a paravertebral ganglion, we call it now a splanchnic nerve. The splanchnic nerve goes to one of these ganglion, which are prevertebral ganglion, or also called collateral ganglion, such as the celiac ganglion here. We have our synapsing, and then we send the message out. Okay, those are our 3 ways. Now, we said there is a 4th, and the 4th way is our exception. So let's go through these. So here's number 1. 1, 2, 3. Okay, first one, we're going to synapse at the same level ganglion with a postganglionic neuron to the organ, and that ganglion is paravertebral or collateral. That's number 1. And you can see it over here. They're all just mushed together here. It's harder to see. 2, we're going to ascend or descend the sympathetic chain. We're going to synapse at a different level ganglion of that organ, and guess what kind of organ it is again? See if I can write this in here. We'll do it. We'll write it over here. Paravertebral again. Okay. The third one, we pass through the sympathetic chain, the paravertebral, without synapsing. And then we form a splanchnic nerve, and we go to a prevertebral ganglion, and we synapse there. Okay, that's our 3. Our exception then is we don't synapse in either. We go through the paravertebral without synapsing. We form a splanchnic nerve. We go through the prevertebral ganglion without synapsing, and we go to the adrenal gland medulla to stimulate adrenaline release. Oh, now I didn't tell you. You might say, Michael, you said it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. So when you say, oh, my adrenaline was really pumping, what you're really saying is you released a lot of epinephrine from your adrenal medulla during some activity you were doing. Okay, so as you see, these words are new. They're a little complicated. They sound a little bit the same, right? We say prevertebral, we say paravertebral, we say preganglionic, we say postganglionic, right? We have different ganglia. We have sympathetic, we have parasympathetic. So part of what you need to do when you're studying is really get the terminology down. When you read a question, you want to be able to quickly understand where you are in that question, how it, what are we in the sympathetic? Are we in the parasympathetic? Are we before the ganglia? Are we after the ganglia? Then you can answer questions like, is it myelinated? Is it not myelinated? Where are we sending the information to? And in a little while, we'll talk about what kind of neurotransmitters are there, things like that. You need to know all that to be able to do this well. Okay, so we're going to stop there. In the next lecture, we're going to pick up and we're going to talk about parasympathetic, and we're going to compare it back to sympathetic. So we'll do a little bit of review of sympathetic while we're doing parasympathetic. Luckily, parasympathetic's a lot easier. So hopefully that'll make more sense to you. And review this as needed, please. Thanks.